For black people in this country, there's never been a place to run, no place to hide, no corner safe from the reach of injustice. Injustice was everywhere, in the fields and in the plantations, in the courtroom, in the newspapers, and even in your own home. It wore badges, it held elected office, it passed down judgments, it passed laws. It was your landlord, it was your boss. It was everywhere. Injustice did not rest when it came to black people. Truth could not run it, and lies and hatred walked alongside it. And that's what we're going to talk about in this video. This is the beginning of a new series I'm doing. It's called No Escape, because that is what we faced. A life of injustice, pain, brutality, and humiliation that we could not escape from. We lived and died in it. The story I'm going to tell you about today, it's just one of thousands. One name, one black person, one horrific moment in a never-ending cycle of injustice that never let us go. It kept us in its clutches. Before we get to what happened to the black man I'm going to talk about in this video, I need to set the scene for you first with some historical context. What I'm covering in this video and this series, the fact that we could not escape injustice, is not a new claim. In fact, at the time that this story took place, the 1890s, a debate was already occurring around the same thing that we're talking about here, that black people could not escape injustice and brutality, and we had no protection. If you know your black history, you've heard the name Ida B. Wells. And if you don't, you're about to learn why her name still matters today. Because long before social media, before the NAACP, before the civil rights marches, she was the one keeping the record of what was happening to us. Born in Mississippi in 1862, Wells knew firsthand the barriers and the violence that black people faced for no other reason than they were black. In 1884, she sued a railroad company after being dragged from her seat, and she won, only to have the verdict overturned. But it was the 1892 lynching of 3 of her friends in Memphis that changed everything for her. From that moment on, she made it her mission to expose what was happening to black people. She would go on to publish The Red Record, one of the earliest and clearest accounts of racial violence and terror against black communities across the country. The year 1893 was especially dangerous for black people. Now, to be clear, there were no safe years. There were no breaks from injustice. But this year stands out. More than 150 black people were lynched, with at least 12 of them being in Virginia, where this story takes place. And in the middle of all this brutality and injustice, in early 1893, Ida B. Wells stood before the Metropolitan Church in Washington, D.C. She was there to talk about one thing, and that was lynching in the South. Ida B. Wells said that the South was ruled by a mob, that black people were under siege and attack on all sides. She said even the newspapers encouraged this barbaric behavior. She said it didn't matter how respectable you were, how quiet, how educated, how successful. If you were black, the law would not protect you. And standing beside her as she spoke was Frederick Douglass, the most prominent black voice of the 19th century. He said, for all this country's greatness, there seemed to be nothing, no power, no law, no force that could protect black people from the mob. Now, not everyone agreed with what Wells and Douglass were saying. In fact, not long after their lecture, a white minister named Thomas Dixon Jr. published an essay entitled The Unwritten Law. In it, he rejected the idea that lynching had anything to do with race. He said lynching wasn't about hate, it was about crime. According to him, white mobs weren't targeting black people because they were black. They were simply defending themselves, defending their homes, and defending their women. He said black people committed crimes, and they were punished, period. Now, it's not surprising that Dixon wrote this, because this is the same man who would go on to write the novel The Klansman, which became the basis for the 1950 film The Birth of a Nation, a film that didn't just rewrite history. It glorified the Klan, portrayed black men as predators, and helped inspire the Klan's revival. It was treated as a patriotic epic. It was shown in public theaters and praised widely, and embraced by audiences all across the country, including at the White House, where President Woodrow Wilson watched it. It wasn't just propaganda. It was the first blockbuster movie in America, and Dixon helped to write it. Now, if you're thinking, why is Julian telling me this? Why do I need to know about Ida B. Wells and Frederick Douglass and Thomas Dixon? Some of you might be thinking, I'm just here for the story. And I hear that. But let me tell you something. You cannot understand our story and what has happened to us, or what's still happening to us, without going beyond the surface. Injustice against black people is multi-layered. It's simple and it's complex at the same time. And the debate we're having right now about who gets justice and who doesn't, that debate was already happening over 100 years ago. Remember, I'm not just telling you stories here. I'm not trying to entertain you. I'm trying to teach you about the structured and ordered nature of injustice against black people throughout history. And the story I'm going to tell you about next, it proves what Ida B. Wells said all along. This was about race. Because in this case, the mob didn't just target a black man. They turned on their own to do it. Thomas Smith was born sometime between 1865 and 1875 in Benton, Virginia, near Roanoke. We don't know the exact year he was born, and truthfully, we don't know much about his life. Sadly, what we do know is really only the injustice. But even when the record is thin, we still have a responsibility to tell his story with dignity and with remembrance. By 1893, Thomas was married. He had worked for the Crozier Iron Company, but by the time September came around that year, he found himself out of work. But it wasn't just Thomas who found himself out of work in Roanoke. 1893 wasn't just a bad year for black people being lynched. It was a bad year for white people being out of work. And when they suffer, history tells us that the pain doesn't just stay pain. It turns into something else. That year, the country fell into what became one of the worst depressions it had ever seen. Banks collapsed. Railroads folded. Millions were thrown into poverty. It was known as the Panic of 1893. And in Roanoke, a city that had grown fast off northern investment and coal money, it came crashing down hard. The railroad was the city's backbone. It employed thousands of people. But in the summer of 1893, the Norfolk and Western Railroad Company, one of Roanoke's biggest employers, it experienced a cash crunch, and payroll was missed. Men were left standing in line, waiting for wages that never came. And there were white people in that city who hadn't eaten in days. Families had no coal to heat their homes. Saloons were packed, streets were tense, because the jobs were gone, and the wages were gone. And with them went the illusion of control. And for many of those white men, that loss wasn't just financial. It was personal. Because in a society built on the myth of white manhood as provider and protector, the failure to provide became a crisis of identity. So if they couldn't give their families bread, they could at least prove they could still offer protection. Protection from black men. From a manufactured threat that the black man was dangerous. He was a predator. He was the reason for their decline. You see, this wasn't just about race. It was economic. Because when people are afraid for their future, when fear seeps in deep, that fear looks for a target, someone to blame, someone to punish. And in Roanoke, like so many places across the country, that target was black people. Always a scapegoat. Always the troublemaker. Always the one who deserved what was coming. That's the story of 1893. It's not just about what happened to Thomas. It's about what was already boiling over before he was ever accused. It was in this environment that Thomas Smith found himself. He was black and dealing with everything that came with that. Second-class citizenship, inequality, and injustice, and all the everyday indignities that came with being black in America at that time. But on September 20th, 1893, he walked into something different. A city that was economically depressed, embarrassed, and angry, and looking for a target. Looking for any reason to prove that they were still on top, still dominant, and still in charge. On the morning of September 20th, 46-year-old Sally Bishop came into Roanoke to sell produce at the town market. She brought her 12-year-old son Charles with her. Sally was from the nearby village of Cloverdale. She was married to a farmer named Henry Bishop, and together they had 9 children. Sally set up her stand alongside the other local farmers and began trying to sell what she had to bring in some extra money. According to reports, she was approached by a black man who wanted to know how much she was selling her grapes for. She told him 60 cents. He then said he'd pay that, on the condition that she go with him to deliver the grapes to a woman named Miss Hicks, who lived on Salem Street, not far from the market. Sally followed him. She claimed that he took her to the basement of a building, pulled a razor on her, and told her to hand over whatever money she had. She allegedly gave him $2 that she had in her purse, but according to her, that wasn't enough. He then beat her with a brick until she lost consciousness. And before she passed out, she said he wrapped a wire around her neck and choked her. Sally claimed she was beaten so badly that She laid in that basement for nearly an hour, unconscious. After she regained consciousness, Sally stumbled out of the basement. She was badly bruised and covered in blood. People rushed to her aid to see what had happened. She told them that she had been beaten by what she described as a tolerably black man, wearing a black slouch hat. That was all the mob needed to hear. The mood in Roanoke was already tense, and this accusation, on top of everything else, created a deadly mix. News of the attack spread through the market and began to snowball. With each retelling, more details were added. More violence, more brutality, more horror. It reached a point where some began claiming that the black man had violated Sally and had taken her life. After that, the hunt was on for a black man wearing a black hat. Someone claimed they saw a man matching that description boarding a train just a few blocks away. The mob rushed there. Railroad Police Detective William G. Baldwin spotted Thomas and pulled his weapon on him and took him into custody. Thomas had no idea why they were stopping him. He told them he had nothing to do with an attack on Sally Bishop. As Detective Baldwin carried Thomas back to town on the back of his horse, dozens of mob members threw rocks at him, demanding that Thomas be handed over to them immediately. They wanted to deal with him right then and right there. No courts, no trial, no delay. They wanted to lynch him. But Baldwin held them off, at least for the moment, and he got Thomas to Conway Saloon, where Sally was being treated by doctors. She was asked if Thomas was the man who attacked her. Sally looked at him and said that she thought he looked like the man, but wasn't sure. She then asked to see his hat. When she saw that Thomas had a black hat, she said that he was the one who almost beat her to death. Now, it's worth noting that there are some real holes in Sally's story. First, Thomas had no blood on him. Sally and the papers that reported on the attack described a brutal beating that left her bloody. Yet, Thomas had no blood on him. And it doesn't make much sense why the man who committed such a violent act will remain in town for an hour afterward. But no one asked these questions. Not when Thomas was pulled from the train, and not when Sally identified him based on one thing: his hat. Not a red hat or a green hat, but a black hat. Something half the men in their city could have been wearing that day. They didn't ask a single question because Thomas was black. That was the proof. And that was all that mattered. What more did they need to see? Thomas was rushed to the jail, with the mob hot on his heels, waiting to snatch him. Once there, he was locked in a cell on the second floor. As he sat there, a mob of over 1,000 men began to surround the jail, plotting how to get their hands on him. Soon the town's mayor, Henry Trout, arrived, along with the prosecutor and Judge John Woods. They tried to calm the enraged mob and convince them to leave. They promised that Thomas would get quick justice, that this would all be over soon. Now notice they didn't say that everyone should let the courts handle this. They didn't stand on principle and the rule of law. No, they stood with the crowd and promised them the outcome they wanted. They said, "Save your rope, save the fire," because the court and Judge Lynch would take care of all of this. The mob continued to grow in size and in rage, and men passed around bottles of whiskey, shouting their demands: "Hand Thomas over or else." The mayor and other town officials pleaded with them to disperse, but that went nowhere. The mob was not listening. They weren't backing down. It got so bad that the mayor was forced to call out the Roanoke infantry. By nightfall, the mob had swelled to over 5,000 people. When the militia told the mob to stand down, the men laughed. They said that the soldiers would never fire on them. The soldiers managed to push the crowd back from the jail and secure the building, but not for long. At 7:30 p.m., a crowd of over 1,000 men rushed the jail. Leading them was Sally Bishop's oldest son, who had arrived in Roanoke with nearly 100 extra men to lynch Thomas. The mob now outnumbered the troops and surrounded them. They gave an ultimatum: hand over Thomas or we're coming in. After hours of pleading with the crowd to leave and to disperse, the line finally broke. The mob stormed the building, battering down the door with lumber. They shattered windows and forced their way inside. It's not clear who fired the first shot, but within seconds, the troops unleashed a volley of rounds. The firing went on for minutes. Over 150 rounds were fired, many of them tearing into the side of the Green Memorial Church next door, where worshipers dove beneath the pews to avoid being hit. When it was all over, 17 people were dead. 13 more were wounded. One man had his leg blown off. Another lost his foot. Some were struck in the head. Even Mayor Trout was struck. All of this because a mob wanted blood, and the man they wanted it from was black. They didn't want a trial. They didn't care about evidence, just rage. They turned on each other because some believed the lynching should be stopped, and others believed it should be carried out. Now, in all of this, there's something that we haven't talked about, someone we haven't talked about, and that's Thomas. What was he thinking in that jail cell? Here he was, a young black man who had come into town for innocent reasons, now locked away in a cell, accused of Jim Crow's most hated offense, attacking a white woman. And outside, thousands of white men were going to war, not over his guilt, but whether Thomas deserved to keep breathing, to keep existing. I can only imagine the fear that gripped him, because that's the only thing that comes to my mind when I picture it. Hearing the firing outside, windows shattering, the sound of rage echoing through the walls of that cell. What did Thomas think about? Did he think about his family? Did he think about whether he would live? Would it be quick or slow and painful? And then there was his wife, not even knowing he was in jail, moments away from never seeing her again. This is what I mean when I say that there was no escape. Where was Thomas supposed to go? He wasn't safe on the street. He wasn't safe in a jail cell. The jail was supposed to be secure, a place to wait for a trial. But outside, thousands of men were trying to break in just to take his life. There was no escape for him, only one way out. And for too many black people in this country, that way out came through the mob. The troops and the police were no match for that type of rage and that anger and hatred. The mayor told the soldiers to take their uniforms off, to go home, and to hide. He also ordered that Thomas be taken into hiding. But not everyone agreed. Police Chief John Terry wanted to do the opposite. He said the officers should save themselves and hand Thomas over to the mob. But luckily, he was outvoted by 3 officers who took Thomas across the Roanoke River to a place outside the city limits. When the mob learned that Thomas was no longer in the jail, they turned their fury onto Mayor Trout. He had protected a black man, and in their eyes, that made him guilty too. Guilty enough to hang. The mayor got word of their plans and fled the city. The mob searched hotels and shops looking for him. When they couldn't find him, they went to his home and searched there also. Can I just pause here for 1 second? Because I don't want you to just move past this. This is a really important moment in this story, and one that goes to the insidious nature of Jim Crow and his ideology. Here we have a black man who, by all indications, had done nothing wrong. The mayor wanted to let the courts handle it, and for that, the mayor lost his white status and was lumped in with Thomas. The mayor committed no crime. He had not been accused of doing anything illegal, except he got proximate to blackness, and that meant he was deserving of the same punishment and brutality that was reserved for black people. You see, Jim Crow was not a respecter of persons when you got in his way. When you interfered with his ultimate goal, which was injustice, there had to be a penalty, and the mob wanted to remind the mayor of that. Now, if you remember, 3 officers had outvoted the chief. Well, just as soon as they got Thomas to safety, they all came back down to reality. And the reality was this: Thomas was black, and in their eyes, he still deserved to be lynched. Chief Terry could not agree more. At around 3 a.m. that morning, the men brought Thomas back to the city. The chief made sure the mob knew their plans. He informed one of the members about their movements, and as the officers made their way through the night, they were met by 25 men, who had their faces hidden behind handkerchiefs. Thomas saw the men, and he knew what was about to happen. He knew he was about to be handed over for brutality. So he ran. He tried to get away, tried to save his life, but he didn't make it far before the mob caught him. The mob told the officers to walk in one direction, and they walked with Thomas in the other. They went a short distance and stopped under an electric light at the corner of a street, where they wanted Thomas to confess to the crime. They wanted to hear him say that he attacked Sally Bishop, almost as if to justify the savagery they were about to carry out. Thomas refused to confess to something that he did not do. But his refusal didn't make them pause or rethink their actions, not for 1 second. They quickly tied one end of the rope to a hickory tree, and the other end was put around Thomas's neck. They then strung him up. But even that wasn't enough for them. As Thomas dangled from the tree, they fired at his body. In the early morning hours, thousands came out to view what was left of Thomas. A man with a knife began cutting off pieces to hand out as souvenirs. Parts of the tree, strands of the rope, even pieces of Thomas's clothing. And still, they weren't done. They pinned a sign to his body that read, "Mayor Trout's friend, don't cut him down." Then came a photographer. He brought out his equipment, and he framed the shot, and he captured the scene. Dozens of men, women, and children standing calmly around Thomas's mutilated body. That photograph was printed and sold as a keepsake, a memory, a message for all to remember. Now, as we do in most of the stories that we tell, the image of Thomas is a stand-in. We often do this to give a face to their story, because we rarely have images of them. But the image of Thomas hanging from that tree, the one that was sold as a memento, it still exists. It wasn't lost. It wasn't buried. Now, I can't show it here for obvious reasons, but you really should see it. See what they did to this young black man. See how they treated him. See him dressed in a shabby suit, wearing pants with patches over the knees, dangling just a few feet off the ground, his white socks slipping off of his feet, his tongue and his eyes bulging from his badly swollen face, his ears bleeding from spots where white men carved away souvenirs. Seeing it makes the truth undeniable. I've included the image on my blog for those of you who have the strength to bear looking at it. Even after all of that, the mob wanted more. They weren't satisfied. They wanted the mayor to see. They dragged Thomas's body to Mayor Trout's home. The plan was to lay Thomas in state on the mayor's dining room table and then bury him in Trout's front yard. But the local minister got word of their plan and he intervened. He convinced them to take Thomas's body to the river instead. Once there, they built a pyre and doused his body with coal oil and set him on fire. Over 4,000 people watched Thomas burn. They all shouted, they all cheered, and when the flames began to die down, hundreds of onlookers stepped forward, tossing branches and twigs and anything they could find to keep the fire going. They didn't want anything left of Thomas. They wanted to erase him completely. Watching in the distance was Thomas's 15-year-old sister. She had heard what had happened to her brother and came to town to see about him. But it was too late. All she could do was stand there and watch them burn her brother's body. After that, the mob set their sights back on the mayor and the troops. Mayor Trout had already fled town and he made his way to Lynchburg. Meanwhile, the soldiers who had stood guard at the jail, they returned to their civilian jobs the next morning, only to find anonymous notes waiting for them. The message said, for firing on their white neighbors and for protecting the black man, they should prepare to meet their creator. The aftermath took the same course it always took. The appearance of justice, but no real accountability. A grand jury was convened. Over 200 witnesses testified. 14 men were indicted, but only 4 of those faced felony charges, and just 3 were indicted for lynching Thomas. In the end, 2 men were sentenced to 1 day in jail and a $1 fine. The leader of the mob was given 30 days and a $100 fine. But even that was too much, because the governor commuted his sentence to a single day. It was widely believed that Thomas Smith was innocent, that he had nothing to do with the attack on Sally Bishop. Now, remember I told you at the beginning of this video how in 1893, Ida B. Wells spoke out against lynching and condemned it for what it was? Well, she documented Thomas's case in her book, The Red Record, and she wrote about his innocence. And years later, more evidence came out. In October 1916, the NAACP's monthly magazine, The Crisis, reported that while Thomas was still in custody in 1893, Roanoke police had arrested the real attacker, and that man confessed. But instead of charging him, they let him go, on the condition that he never returned. They knew Thomas was innocent, and still they turned him over to the mob. But there's one more piece to this story, one that caught me off guard when I first read it. There was a song written to commemorate Thomas's lynching. You heard me right, there's a ballad, a very popular ballad about this, and it was called The Roanoke Outrage. If you remember that song by The Temptations, Papa Was a Rolling Stone, the one that starts off with, it was the 3rd of September, the day I'll always remember, the day my daddy died. Well, this song starts off in a very similar way. It opened with the line, it was the 20th of September, when the moon shone from on high, in the magic city of Roanoke. 9 innocent men did die. It then goes on to talk about how the troops fired on the mob and calls Thomas a low-down black person. Except it didn't say black person. it used another word, one I'm not going to say here. The song accused Mayor Trout of betrayal and, in the end, it celebrated Thomas's death, said he was gone from this world to a place that wasn't heaven. Thomas Smith could not escape injustice in life, and he couldn't escape it in death either, because every time they sang that lynching song, it was like lynching him all over again. So when I read that there was a song about this, a ballot to celebrate the lynching of Thomas Smith, I had to pause, because I had never heard of a lynching ballad before. I knew about anti-lynching songs like Billie Holiday's Strange Fruit, songs that mourn the loss, that cried out against the injustice. But this was something different. This was a community turning violence into celebration. So I did some research, because I needed to know, was this just Roanoke? And what I found out stunned me. The Roanoke ballad wasn't unique. It was a part of a larger pattern, a tradition even, one where white communities didn't just commit acts of terror, they sang about them. They turned public executions into verses. They passed the stories down, not with the shame but with pride. These songs were often set to familiar folk melodies, the kind everyone in town would have known. But the lyrics are filled with vengeance, with justification and triumph. They didn't mourn the violence. They bragged about it. They turned mayhem into memory, and memory into music. Because this wasn't just about cruelty. It was about culture. A culture that wanted to remember. A culture that wanted to sing about what they did. And one of the most well-known examples is the lynching ballad of the death of Emma Hartzell, written after the 1898 lynching of two black men in North Carolina who allegedly took the life of a 12-year-old white girl. The song didn't disappear with the generation that created it. It was revived decades later and recorded in the 1960s by J.E. Maynard and treated like it was just another song. Before I close, let me say this. I don't tell these stories to give you some Jim Crow true crime series. That's not why I'm doing this. I tell them so that you truly understand and appreciate what it has meant to be black in this country and what it still means today. What happens to a people who have never been able to escape injustice, could not escape slavery, could not escape convict leasing, could not escape black codes and peonage, could not escape the Klan, could not escape lynching or Jim Crow, could not escape segregation, could not escape mass incarceration or housing discrimination? What happens to that people? Do they thrive? Do they make it to the upper echelons of society? Do they pass down generational wealth? Or do they struggle? Do they live in underserved and under-resourced neighborhoods? Do they suffer worse health outcomes? Do they face limited economic opportunities? What do you think? So when people say, why don't they just work harder? Why don't they just try harder? Why don't they just stop complaining? I would say to them, do you know who Thomas Smith was? Do you know what happened to him in 1893? Do you know the names and the stories of all those who lived and died in injustice, who could never escape it? You may not know them, but you know their descendants, the ones here today, the ones who inherited that pain and that trauma and that lack. And what will they pass down? We have to tell these stories. What really happened to us has to come forth into the light and out of the shadows and darkness of injustice and brutality. The truth of what has happened to us has to overtake the lie that tries to minimize it. Thomas Smith was here. He lived and he loved. He was someone's son, someone's brother, someone's friend, someone's husband, and he might have been someone's father. His arc was cut short because he was black, because he lived in a world that said he did not matter. But Thomas did matter. What happened to him mattered. He might not have been able to escape injustice in 1893, but today we give him justice by remembering his name, his story, and even his tragic death. As I keep saying, memory is a form of justice, and we will give that to him today. That's the least that we can do. This is the first video in my new series titled No Escape, and in the next video, I'll be back with another name and another story of how we could not escape a world we did not create. Another story that explains why we couldn't dream, because a nightmare had already been planned for us and put on daily repeat. I hope you'll come back and you'll join me as we tell these stories. Now it's time to hear from you. Had you ever heard of Thomas Smith, and did anything move you or stick with you from this story? Leave me a comment and let me know.